Hello, and welcome to the world after the coronavirus. If you are tired of the utter dystopia in which we are living, you came to the right place. Today with us is a special guest, Vijay Prashad, but before I announce the guest, let us just have a very short recap of the main events which happened today. As you probably know, as of today, India, which means more than 7 million people, and the UK are under lockdown. As we speak also, the Olympic Games in Tokyo are postponed for the next year. We have also seen beautiful gestures of solidarity, the Cuban doctors arriving to Italy. We can also see that the Chinese arrived to Serbia, which besides solidarity also already opens questions which we will tackle with our guest tonight, which is also the future of geopolitics. We could have also seen, after the images from China and after the images from Italy, we could have seen the satellite images of New York, and we could have seen that the air pollution is radically going down. So many things are happening at the same time, and this is the reason why we launched this online television. Yesterday, our guest was Yanis Varoufakis. You can still watch it on YouTube. Our guest tonight is Vijay Prashad. You will also be able to watch it later online. If you want, you can register for the next events, which means that you will get a direct link to the live stream, but you can already pose all the questions you want to pose to the next guests, which are Larry Charles, Noam Chomsky, Gael Garcia Bernal, Saskia Sassen, many other people, John Shipton, father of Julian Assange, next week maybe also Slavoj Žižek, and many others. So use the registration form on DiEM25.org. But this is enough for an introduction. Let me introduce you to our tonight's guest. It is my dear friend from India, but he's not in India. He is usually on three continents. That's the reason why he's the director of the Free Continental Institute for Social Research. He's an author of more than 20 books, editor, publisher, and tonight with him we will discuss 16 points how to tackle the current crisis. And after we give the floor to Vijay, we will also have an opportunity, as always, to get questions from you. I will get it from the YouTube chat. But as said, if you want to pose in advance, register. So before we start with the hard topics, Vijay, with the 16 points, please say hello to our audience and tell us, where are you? Are you also in self-isolation as me and many people in the world?
Hi, good evening. Nice to be with you. Yes, I think most of the planet has been asked to be in self-isolation. As you said, the government of India has asked 1.4 billion people to self-isolate. It's, I think, important to say that maybe almost 1 billion of them will not be able to self-isolate. This is one of the odd things about our time, where people in affluent countries, people who don't live in slums are able to, feel the claustrophobia of entering their homes and shutting the door. But much of the planet is made up of day laborers, people who rely on a daily wage. And unless we change the system, people who are in that camp of the world, who live in slums and are daily workers, are going to get obliterated, not only by this virus, but of course, by the many viruses that put pressure on their lives.
I just realized I was muted by the big brother. I didn't do it. Thanks for raising this point. It's an important point. I think about it every day, especially when I look at the Twitter feed from Europe, and then you will see so many people complaining, I'm in self-isolation, I don't know what to eat anymore, and so on. And, from the perspective of India, Asia, Latin America, I think this really looks like a luxury and a privilege. Even when our authorities in Europe say, oh, you should self-isolate, they don't speak about housing, they don't speak about all those measures which should have been implemented even before someone can self-isolate. You and me are happy and those who watch us, I hope you're happy to be self-isolated and to have the opportunity to be at a place.
But let's not exaggerate the European issue or the issue of the United States. Last year, the US Federal Reserve did a survey of households and said that 40% of American households cannot meet an emergency above $400. In other words, if they had an emergency of $400, a medical bill, a car problem, or something like that, 40% of the US population would not be able to meet their expenses. And I'd like to say that the Eurostat, I looked at it today just because I was going to be chatting with you. Eurostat had a similar survey and showed that 32%, 1 in 3 Europeans is unable to meet an emergency expense. And you know, this lockdown is an emergency expense. People don't have the money to pay rent, to pay mortgage. They don't have the money to pay for the testing in many countries. They don't have the money to eat, you know, more than 2 or 3 or 5 or 6 days, depending on the size of their households. So, I mean, we are actually, you know, in the middle of a crisis that capitalism has produced. The conjuncture of this crisis is the coronavirus. The coronavirus has, in a sense, pushed over a system that has been very, very sick for a very long time. And I think this has shocked a lot of people. You know, a lot of people have, in the middle of this particular crisis, the corona crisis, the inability of their governments to take care of them. I think a lot of people have now begun to question, you know, the kind of promises fed to them, you know, the promises by education institutions, by televisions, by the corporate media, by their governments. These promises now seem so very empty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's also an important point what you made about Europe, because what we can see in many countries in Europe is precisely this decade of austerity, which ruined the public infrastructure, hospitals, you know, the kind of infrastructure which was usually used for this kind of crisis situation. But instead of just analyzing the situation and showing what is bad and what is worrying, many people also yesterday after the chat with Yanis Varoufakis asked me, could we please in the next episode actually come up with some concrete proposals? What can be done in this situation? So you worked on it together with your comrades and different organizations and movements to come up with 16 very concrete points which can what could be done in the global pandemics. Could you perhaps elaborate it in like 10 minutes or up to 15, and then I will take the questions in the meantime and we can chat.
Okay, I mean, I would really like to. I should just first say that the International Assembly of the Peoples is an international organization, or not organization really, it's a sort of platform of about 700 organizations from over 80 countries. It's a very expansive body. And we in Tricontinental, the Institute for Social Research, worked in collaboration with the Assembly. And we came up with what we thought is a very rational plan, you know, which starts with things like suspending non-essential work, you know, what's already happening. I mean, part of the point of elaborating the agenda was to show that we can't do things in a piecemeal fashion, you know, lockdown here, something else there. It doesn't give confidence, you know, to have somebody sort of clownish character like Boris Johnson one day say one thing, another day say another thing. No, you have to give people a sense of confidence. Do you have a full plan? So we wanted to articulate a plan of 16 points, and that's available on our website and so on. So that's one broad thing. Second broad thing I want to say before entering the exact issues is that, you know, one of the great victories of neoliberalism, this philosophy that capitalism has been pushing for the last, you know, almost 100 years, one of the great victories of neoliberalism is to suggest that the state and state institutions themselves are authoritarian or a problem, and that the state shouldn't do things. You know, the private sector should do things, or if the state is involved, the private sector should be a partner, what's known as public-private partnerships. The state itself should not be involved in anything. And so what you've seen in terms of austerity and so on is actually the outcome of an ideological battle to destroy not only state institutions, but also the concept of the state. It's all very well to have a police force and a military, but it's not good to have public health. That's the thinking they've promoted for the last 8 decades or so. When Hayek wrote his book, Friedrich Hayek, The Road to Serfdom, what he was saying is the road to making state institutions is going to lead you to the gulag, essentially. On the other side of it, what Corona has shown us is countries with a robust state institutions, whether it's China, People's Republic of China, or it's South Korea, they have still robust state institutions, have been able to tackle this virus. They have state institutions. The small state of Kerala, for instance, population 35 million in India, has built and maintained, against a lot of pressure, state institutions. Pressure from whom? From the International Monetary Fund, for instance, which says, kill off your state. So the second broad point is that we have to come back and make an argument for the importance of public institutions. Whether you call this the state or whatever you call it, public institutions are key. Without public health, without public hospitals, we're sunk. This is not the last coronavirus. This is not the last SARS. There are going to be more episodes of these. This is now the beginning of a new period. So we have to build public institutions. This is a very key thing. I don't just mean in the 16 points we write about, well, we need more public health, fine. But we also need more public control of pharmaceutical companies. You see, what happens is the rich have a certain set of medical problems. Their medical problems are valuable to create medicines for because there's a market for them. So pharmaceutical companies go to the ailments of the rich. Some of them are acute problems, diabetes and so on. Now, these have also become problems of the poor. But nonetheless, that's how pharma goes. Where there's money, they go. They're not necessarily going to spend a lot of money experimenting on potential problems and so on. They're not planning necessarily for future problems. So more public institutions, more public control over the planning for, tragedies of various kinds, very important. I'll just give you an example when I say what is public control. You had the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. In fact, even though there was a lot of music and noise about the need for public regulation of financial markets, basically nothing was done. Right now, the financial markets are down by an enormous percentage. They may lose up to 50% of their value, admittedly overvalued, but 50% of their value in the next week or so from the peak to where we are now. Some of this has to do with oil prices because Russia and Saudi Arabia couldn't make a deal. Okay, that's fine. But how do you explain this? That equity prices collapsed and bond prices collapsed. So one of the reasons is traders had started once again to produce new kinds of vehicles where they were basically doing repo deals on government bonds. And these have now been shown to have collapsed in terms of price. So public control, proper public control of financial instruments, very important, very key. On the 16 points, we talk directly about the need for more public institutions, the need for more pressure to be put. If you're going to, for instance, in Spain, pretend to nationalize your hospitals, I don't think they're really nationalizing anything. The headline says Spain nationalizing hospitals. No, you're not nationalizing it. It's a shell game. But if you're going to nationalize hospitals in a time of emergency, if you're going to have so-called socialist practices in a time of emergency, why not have them in a time when there's not emergency? Why do you only come to socialist policies at a time of emergency? What about when you're not in an emergency? So I think this is part of the demand people need to make from below. We need more public institutions, no question. We need more public control of certain important sectors of human life. I gave the example of pharmaceuticals. I gave the example of finance. Okay, maybe you want to have a financial sector. Maybe until we have a different kind of society, we're going to have to tolerate having a financial sector and so on. We need better public control. And the other point I want to make here, and then, we can chat about this. The other important point, I think, is the question of income. We've seen over the course of the last 30 years, because of vast productivity gains, shift of production to so-called low-wage countries and so on, we've seen large-scale structural unemployment and large-scale structural underemployment, what they call precarious employment, the growth of the precariat, the precarious proletariat. We've seen this globally. Globally, you've seen more and more millions, hundreds of millions of people unable to find, a full-scale proper job. So on the table for a long while has been the question of a universal basic income. Everybody provided some sort of cash payment. Households provided a certain amount of money, individuals provided money. There are other demands, living wages, for instance, or government-sponsored jobs programs. All these things are back on the agenda. But what I want to suggest again is, what happens in a crisis is that the capitalist class, the bourgeois politicians and so on, they use the crisis to their advantage. What happens to people's movements is we get outflanked. We'll make certain demands, but we don't seem to have, the legs, as it were, to make sure that we can also move in a crisis in a direction of our choosing. And part of that is because our movements maybe are not strong enough. Obviously, that's part of it. So I'm not naive about this, but we still need to put these things on the agenda to focus the work of our movements. For instance, on universal basic income. See, the capitalist class has used this concept in a very distorted way. They are saying, let's not pay social welfare. Let's not spend money on public schools, public education, public health, public parks, public transportation. No, let's bundle this money, give you a cash payment, and then privatize all that and you have to buy it. No, why should I buy private insurance? Why should I buy a ticket to ride the bus? All of this should be socially provided. And on top of that, I should get a universal basic income. That's the way we've got to see it. The universal basic income is not a substitute for this stuff, for taking away everything else. It's a supplement to having a social benefit and a social society. By the way, people may ask, how will you fund all this? I mean, listen, guys, there's $36 trillion sitting in tax havens. We need to have capital controls in our societies so that people are forced to work within their tax jurisdiction. They can't keep taking money here and there, looking for low tax places. That's very important. We need to have wealth taxes. Why should the rich get away with not paying tax? I'm not interested in writing a Twitter, message saying, thank you, Bill Gates, for donating money for corona research. I mean, I want to say, Bill Gates, I don't want your donation. I want your taxes. We should demand taxation from them, not philanthropy. And I think there is enough resources in our society, billions, trillions of dollars spent on defense, trillions in tax havens. Accumulate the resources, produce a social, decent society, not this kind of criminal society where one SARS virus is able to basically paralyze all of us.
Let me come back to the question of the state and also the question of the role of financial institutions today, because you have a very interesting concrete proposal there. When it comes to the state, I think what's really important, what you are showing now is that even the neoliberals now are becoming aware that the state is an important factor, whatever anarchists would think about it. But in this kind of situation of crisis, you obviously need transnational cooperation, massive infrastructure projects and similar. And what I really like maybe just to share with you was this idea which seemed completely crazy 2 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, by Frederick Jameson, the great US scholar, who wrote a book which sounds crazy already. It's called American Utopia, where he proposes to look at the US Army and to use the US Army as an emancipatory institution. Where you can see it today, instead of the army going to wars for oil, which is completely unnecessary now. I mean, it was always unnecessary, but now it's bluntly unnecessary to have wars on oil because no one can move at all anyhow. So if you take Frederick Jameson's idea of the army as something which might be emancipatory, and you can already see it in the coronavirus times, that the army has to help the population and not to go to war. So, and that's only the army. What about all the other institutions?
Well, let's actually take that directly. I mean, we already have an example of an army of a country that doesn't go and fight people but goes to heal, and that's Cuba. I mean, Cuba has produced, I don't like using this word, but I'm going to do it because of what you said. Cuba has produced an army of doctors and medical practitioners and nurses. I mean, without Cuban medical support, the Ebola would not have been contained. It's a very false story that the United States government says, well, we sent people, and no, the Cubans were there in West Africa, played a frontline role alongside African doctors who played a very key role in tackling Ebola. Today, Cuban doctors once again are at the front line. Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil, who, I don't understand how somebody of that caliber can become the head of a government. It tells you something about the right wing, that these are the kind of clownish figures it produces. But when Bolsonaro came to power in Brazil, one of the quick things he did was expel Cuban doctors, just as they did in Bolivia, when that other clownish character, Anez, came to, power through the coup. She expelled Cuban doctors. Today, the Brazilians want the Cuban doctors back because they realize that Cuba has used its surplus not to produce an immense army, to go and bomb people and etc. It's produced an army of doctors and medical practitioners. The Chinese, for instance, there's a debate about, did the Chinese not do enough in the early period? And I'm very happy to have that debate because I've been talking to people in China about the sequence of events, before China informed the WHO. To my mind, there was no suppression. This thing happened extraordinarily fast. 21st December to 3rd January, they informed the WHO. That's a very short window. I don't see any evidence of massive suppression and so on. It's the Trump administration trying to use the fact that this virus apparently begins in Wuhan. They want to use this for geopolitical ends. But the truth is, people around the world are seeing it's Chinese doctors who are traveling around the world, bringing supplies, helping people, whether it's in Italy, as you said, or Serbia, or indeed it's in Greece, where supplies have just arrived from China. It's Russian doctors who went to Venezuela. Venezuelans asked the International Monetary Fund for $50 billion to help them finance some of the imports of machinery to tackle Corona. And the International Monetary Fund, which had said we have $1 trillion sitting here, and anybody who's a member can apply for this money, Venezuela promptly applied. They denied them. This is Washington denying Venezuela. The Russians sent doctors. I mean, we're in a different period now. You can see who's heartless and whose state has collapsed, and you can see whose state exists and is attempting to be decent on the world stage.
Mm-hmm. Not only that, I also think that what it shows is how geopolitically the world is rapidly changing, where basically those states who had a completely irresponsible response at the national level are also having a very dark response on the international level. Like you mentioned, Venezuela and so on, but another example would be the sanctions towards Iran. Instead of helping the people of Iran, who could then later help us, because I think it's also a question of temporality. China has already been where we are today and where the United States or Brazil will be in a few days or few weeks. So instead of inviting them, and I would even put it differently, the European, it also shows the lack of the geopolitical, any kind of geopolitical policy of or vision of the European Union. It should have been the European Union who sent doctors to China or to Serbia these days, or Croatia or other countries and so on. But it also shows, but let me come to my question about the financial institutions, and then I see we have many questions from people watching us. So just a bit more patience, because I think there is one important point, all of them are, but one about in the 16 points you developed, One is about the suspension of dollar as the international currency. You are demanding that the United Nations should call for a new international currency. Could you explain this, why, and so on? Maybe even for people who are not so familiar with the economic language.
No, this is a very complicated issue, but the bottom line is twofold. It's actually not just the dollar, it's the dollar denominated financial system, or it's what we call the dollar Wall Street complex. You know, a country like Iran, even if it wants to trade with a third country, let's say India or Nepal or any of these countries, often has to denominate the trade in dollars. You know, more than half the world's trade is denominated in dollars, and it has to use a financial wire system that's based in the European Union, which is known as the SWIFT wire system, or you may know them as the SWIFT codes. So Iran can't have an independent relationship with countries. It has to go through the United States and go through Europe. So, you know, in that sense, we don't have an international financial system. We have a financial system that's dominated by the North Atlantic, by the United States and by Brussels in this case, because SWIFT is in Brussels. I mean, what we need is we need to go beyond having financial, having economic systems where things are denominated against the dollar. It allows the United States extraterritorial economic power immediately. You know, the US can print money without worry of inflation because the money is used outside its boundaries, outside its jurisdiction. You know, for instance, the Indian rupee is not used outside India, but the Indian rupee is constrained by its value against the dollar. I mean, everything is about the dollar. So it's that proposal we have of opening the question of international currency. It's a very old debate. You know, when the IMF started, they had a currency. They still have a currency called standard drawing rights, SDRs. It's a very bad name for a currency. But there has been a long-standing discussion of how trade should be denominated. You know, why should, for instance, Libya hold dollars in their central bank? You know, why can't they hold an international currency? If Libya wants to do a trade with Italy, why does it have to move from its currency to the dollar and then to, you know, the euro? Why can't it just go directly? It can denominate trade in its own language, in its own currency and so on. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. No. I just wanted to touch Libya, what you just mentioned, because why can't they? I mean, if you of course know, you know that just before the Libyan regime, and I don't have many good words for Gaddafi, don't get me wrong, but we also have to look it from all sides. Just before he was overthrown by then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and also Sarkozy at that moment. Well, what did he want to introduce? A Pan-African currency. And that was a big problem because the French National Bank actually had all the control in West Africa.
Yes, I mean, in most Francophone countries, they still use the franc. And he proposed the Afrique as the currency, which, you know, it's an amazing idea. I mean, why can't there be continental currencies? In fact, the Bolivarian movement in South America, led by Hugo Chavez, came up with the idea of having a currency for the continent, which initially they produced as a digital currency, you know, so that trades between Brazil and Venezuela or, you know, Ecuador, whatever, need not be dollar denominated. They could be denominated in the continent. You know, you don't have to import American inflation. You know, there's all kinds of problems with using the dollar, which we don't think about. And so that's it's actually a narrow demand with a much broader discussion to be had about the nature of sovereignty of parts of the world from the dollar Wall Street complex. You know, the question that I want to give you just as a fact is I was looking at the International Finance Institute, International Institute of Finance, and they have a number out since late January. Almost $68 billion has fled the global south for the north. $68 billion. That means they are hemorrhaging money. You know, people, as uncertainty develops, so-called emerging markets are losing money. Now people are worrying what's going to happen to Wall Street, what's going to happen to, you know, the London Stock Exchange. what's going to happen to these countries that are struggling with an enormous dollar-denominated debt, which is not being forgiven? One of the demands that needs to be right there is we need to call for a debt jubilee. You know, all debts will be scrapped right now. Let's start there.
Fully agree. I mean, if you look at the historical disasters from Egypt, and David Graeber has written a book on it, you can see that that was the first step towards sort of restart of society, at least a possibility to give an opportunity to the poor to come back to social life, economy, and so on. But since this is also interactive, although it's only the two of us, but we follow the comments of people, let me start by just posing questions and then we can together talk about it. One is a quite Kantian question, I would say. You know, the Kantian concept of the Weltbürgertum, of the global government and society. So the question is, how can you implement a global taxation on capitalist profits if you don't have a global government willing to implement it? I think it's very concrete. We could also add, how can we implement any of the 16 points, the suspension of dollar and so on, if you don't have a global government willing to implement it? Is the global government at all, I'm adding my question, a good idea?
Well, I'm not in favor of a global government at this time. It's impossible. You know, look, the United Nations is relatively paralyzed at this time. Yesterday, the UN Secretary General, I think quite rightly, called for a ceasefire in all wars. You know, for instance, Yemen and so on. We're in a huge, human crisis. How can you be fighting these wars? I thought it's a very important statement he made. Nobody takes it seriously. I don't even know if you heard about, that the UN Secretary General, no. So what we need, I think, in the very short term, is we need to fight to get countries more sovereignty over their economies, and we need more regionalism. For instance, let's go back to the African case. I would like to see West African countries, Senegal, for instance, have sovereignty over its economy, not be subordinated to the French franc. And I would like to see the African Union have a much bigger role to play in the continent. I mean, the first thing that I would suggest to a government, if a government said, what should we do? I would say implement capital controls. Don't let money come in and out, what's known as hot money. Don't let money come in and out. Implement capital controls. Unless you implement capital controls, none of this can work. If you implement capital controls, the wealthy cannot escape with their money. Then you tax them. You see, the thing is, the assumption is if you tax the rich, economic activity stops. Let me ask you a question. Over the last couple of weeks, as these quarantines have taken place, economic activity has stopped, correct? Why has it stopped? Because labor has vanished. This is proving the Marxist point that it's labor that creates value, not money. Money doesn't make value. If labor goes on a state-imposed general strike, the whole of capitalism shudders to a halt. So if you put capital controls, you tax the wealthy, put a wealth tax on them, economic activity is not going to stop. Economic activity will continue. Labor will continue. Now you can use that money from the wealthy for a productive use. You need to build public institutions in these societies. So in that sense, we're not looking for a global government. We're looking to strengthen the sovereignty of regions. Allow the Bolivarian project in South America to grow, allow the African Union to grow, allow the South Asian unity to take place. If you are in favor of European unity, why is it that Europe always goes and attacks other people's attempts at unity? Europe is very happy to talk about the European Union. That's fine. But meanwhile, when the Bolivarians are trying to create a Bolivarian project in South America, Europeans join with the United States to undermine that project over there. Europeans undermine the project in the African Union. So, I mean, what's good for the goose should be good for the gander. Why should I, blow my trumpet for the European Union if Europeans are against the African Union?
Good question, but there comes a question from Europe, from Hungary, which I think is also a comment on what we said about China, and we mentioned China. So there is a question from Hungary coming. Thanks a lot for posing us so many questions. The question goes as this. We received 10 planes of masks, gloves, and other medical aid to arrive from China. Has Orban's illiberal connections with China paid off when the European Union failed?
Well, this is a question to ask of Orban and the Chinese government, whether the connections have paid off. But we have already seen that the Chinese have offered to send supplies to all kinds of countries. There's no litmus test, it's, as far as I can see. China hasn't said, oh, are you a country that has been pro-China before, and therefore we will help you? I don't see that. I mean, I don't know about you, but I'm not seeing that at all. They have said openly, any country that wants assistance, we provide it. Now, for instance, India, it's a good example. India and China don't have a very close relationship. China has been pursuing the Belt and Road Initiative. India has instead joined with the US in the Indo-Pacific strategy, a strategy that the US government, the Trump administration, has developed to counter the Belt and Road. And yet the Chinese government has said, say the word, we'll send supplies. So I'm not really convinced that this is entirely a political motivated thing. Now, it could very well be, and let's not be silly about it, could very well be that the Chinese are saying this is a soft power opportunity. Fine. But I don't think we should reduce it to that. I'm not one to believe everything happens cynically. I think that they are saying this is a pandemic. We have been able to squelch it inside China. We have a huge amount of equipment that we can send to you. We don't need it anymore. We're going to send it. I mean, if they send it to India, what does that say about the planes going to Hungary?
There is another question connected to China, and you just mentioned actually the One Belt, One Road initiative, and I think many people are wondering what is going to happen to this new Silk Road, as it is called. And the question is, will Chinese infrastructure projects around the world be successful in the ensuing next 2 decades?
I think this is a very important question. Firstly, I would like to just directly say that I think it's an extraordinarily racist thing that the Trump administration is doing in calling this a Chinese virus, or even worse, people using phrases like Kung flu. I think that's just offensive and racist. And it's racist because it doesn't understand that viruses are not like that. The Spanish flu didn't start in Spain. The only reason it's called the Spanish flu is that it was wartime and Spain didn't have a censorship. So the Spanish media covered what was happening. That flu apparently started in Kansas, in a US military establishment where there was chicken to human transmission of the flu. But we don't call it the American flu and say America should pay reparations. 60% of the people who died in the influenza epidemic of 1918, 1919 were from India. So India should now claim reparations from the United States. That's ridiculous. Doesn't work like that. In 1832, cholera came from my home state of West Bengal in India. That's where it was first discovered in 1817. It comes and destroys Europe. I mean, France was devastated, Britain, United States. That cholera from 1823 lasts till 1923. It's a 100-year cycle of cholera. It's incredible. We called it at the time an Asiatic cholera in the same racist way. That's not how viruses begin. Virus can begin anywhere, and we have to have a much more human understanding of this. This idea we'll blame the Chinese for it. It is true that this attempt at saying it's a Chinese virus is going to dent China in the short term. So when China says we're going to build high-speed rail that goes all the way into Turkey and so on, people may say, well, let's rethink this, because do we want viruses to come that fast from China into, Italy again and whatever? I mean, God forbid it comes to Paris. In the 1832 cholera, the French actually passed a resolution in their parliament saying cholera will not impact us because we are white and we are democratic. This is an authoritarian Asiatic problem. It devastated Paris. It obliterated populations. So I think in the short term, Belt and Road will suffer a little bit as a consequence of this ideological barrage. But look, let's face it, there is no other game in town. What the Chinese are doing in providing infrastructure or building infrastructures, they are looking for new markets, new kind of international order. For sure, they have an interest. But many of these other countries don't have the ability to raise funds to build their infrastructure. So yes, there will be a short-term dip in the Belt and Road. But I think in time, reality is going to sink in. And I think we'll be back in business with the BRI. I mean, the Indo-Pacific strategy that the US government is pushing is so wildly underfunded, because there's no state funds that can come in there and underwrite the American challenge to Belt and Road.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning the example of the Spanish flu. I recently rediscovered that also Antonio Gramsci was actually writing about it. And it shows, as you said, already the sort of racism, xenophobia at that time. Also, we should blame the other European countries which were not reporting about it, and not the Spanish. But I also like how you put it, like mentioning Spanish flu, cholera, and there is, of course, the Black Death, the plague. And if you think about it a bit, then we come to this perspective, which I find very fruitful, your perspective, which is the long-term perspective, system theory perspective. If you look at the plague, you will see that it also came from China. It was made in China because it came through the Silk Road to Europe. It needed around 10 years to arrive to Dubrovnik, Venice, and cities mainly in the Mediterranean. But what is interesting that it didn't really come from China, in the sense that maybe it originated geographically from China, but it was a consequence of the Mongolian Empire attacking China years before. So they created the foundations for the spread of the plague. And then in the same way that the new Silk Road is creating the foundations for the circulation of the virus, at that time the Mongolian warriors were actually bringing warriors, traders, and so on, bringing the plague to Europe. And I'm just amazed how it seems, as Hegel said, if we learned anything from history, it is that we don't learn anything from history, But it also shows that we need to have this long-term perspective, looking towards the future. Maybe now the situation is bad, and it will definitely be even worse during the next months. But in 1 or 2 years, we actually already now have to be constructing the world after. So that's why I think everyone should read the 16 points of the Tricontinental and the Assembly of the People and check out Vijay's work. But I don't want to monopolize it too much because I can see many other questions coming. That's an interesting question, and I heard it actually many times today. So let us hear what you have to say about it. Do you think that Italy will leave the European Union after the crisis? I would add a new question. Do you think it might leave the euro?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very interesting question. It comes back to the question of what is the European Union? And what is a union in the first place? What is a collectivity of peoples? If you're not able to help somebody in a crisis, what's the point of being in a framework together? I think this is a question that the Italians may want to pose to Brussels directly. Greece, I think, could have posed it in that way as well. And I think, Yanis did when he was the finance minister. If you are not going to come in and negotiate in a, let's say, humane way, in a way of solidarity, then what's the point of Greece being in the Eurozone? What's the point of it? You're not treating us like people you're treating us like aliens. The racism of it, you are lazy, don't work as hard as Northern Europeans. I mean, all this is very familiar. So in my opinion, the real question to ask of any unity, if you're part of a collective process, a unity of nations, a unity within a nation and so on, if you ask the question, what is our unity for? If we ask actually in every country, what is our government for? What is the state for? What is their purpose? If I am not finding these institutions helping me in a time of crisis, then why should I belong to them? I think this is a very important question. If the governments, like if the Trump administration is much more interested in bailouts to airlines and so on, I think it's a good question to ask. What is the United States government for? I thought it was very important when the leader of the Air Hostesses Union in the United States said, don't give a bailout to the companies, give it to the workers in the airlines. I thought that was a very good class perspective to put out there. So I would sympathize with the Italian people raising the question. You see, it's not a question of let's leave the EU. It's not that. That's not the point. The point is, I think a question must be asked of European institutions. Where were you at the time of the crisis? Why were countries so quick to shut their borders at the time of a crisis? This is not the first time Germany has shut its borders. I would say during the crisis of Greece's finances, Germany closed its borders. It's not the first time. A broad question should be asked. What is the point of an institution? Not in a time of normalcy, but in a time of crisis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, unfortunately, we see that the role of institutions in time of crisis is what Carl Schmitt described. It's state of exception, which then basically just enough to look at Hungary, you know, how the situation is being used by those for whom this comes as a silver lining, as a kind of wet dream coming true. They will just rule on the tree, stay with all the measures and so on. That's one perspective. There is also the other hopeful perspective, which we are trying to bring back. There are two India-connected questions. The first one is, in terms of public institutions, has there been any take-up of Aperovit's ideas in India as in smaller scale public institutions? That's the first one. And the other one is, what is the Modi government going to gain from the crisis, since it is shutting down the massive protest against him?
Well, let's take the second one first, because it's a quicker answer. It's hard to say what they'll gain. I mean, you know, Mr. Modi is able to produce popularity. He had a very, I thought, silly idea on Sunday for people to go outside in public and bang pots and pans, make noise to thank, you know, medical practitioners. I mean, what's the point of doing that if you're not providing medical practitioners as the government with masks, with equipment and so on? You're not doing what you should be doing. Instead, you're out there telling people, go outside and make noise for them. I find this very dangerous. It's a kind of demagogic politics. You know, what you want the government to do is provide right now for frontline people of this crisis. You know, they need to have all government support. You know, we need equipment, we need gloves, we need masks, we need all kinds of things. You know, stop producing garbage, start producing this. We need it, you know. Change lines of production. That's what the Chinese did. They halted certain production and they said masks. That's why they have this enormous supply of masks to come and provide for people. So the Modi government is, to my mind, useless, but they are able to manipulate public opinion in a very crafty way. So let's not get too much into that. The first point is very interesting. My colleague Subin Dennis and I just published a small article on the response in the government by the left government in Kerala to the coronavirus. And we laid out, you know, what they've done. They've had these slogans: break the chain, physical isolation, but social unity. You know, these are their slogans. But what's very important is when you talk about small scale public institutions, I would actually change it from small scale public institutions to public action. You see, what you have in a state like Kerala, it's 35 million people. It's not a small place. It's a very large, it's a country in many continents. In Europe, it would be a country, 35 million. In Kerala, what you have is you have a highly organized and educated population, almost 100% literacy. People are in trade unions, they're in women's organizations, they're in, you know, cooperatives. There is a women's cooperative called Kudumbushri, which has 4.5 million members. This is out of a total population of 35 million. People are already highly involved and organized. And what this allows, the preparation for a society when you're so highly organized, is public action is immediate. So immediately when the government said, these are the 12 things we're doing, we're going to put money, trade unions mobilized to go to bus stations and quickly erect sinks with hand sanitizer, so that when passengers got off buses, they washed their hands. I mean, this is something the government didn't do. This was something the trade union did. You know, the Kudumbushri, this 4.5 million women's cooperative, started making masks in mass scale. What I want to emphasize is, as part of the evisceration of the state, equal to that has been the relative evisceration of social institutions in our countries. Trade unions have been wiped out by and large. The fact of being in an organization, you know, is so fundamental to building a human society. but people have become individualized. And I exactly agree with you. You go on social media, people are bemoaning their isolation in their homes. Guys, if you were in a social organization, you would find a way to band together to do something productive in your societies. In Kerala, yes, they're going outside, they're protecting themselves, but they know that a very large number of the people are going to be day laborers. How do you break the chain to them? How do you bring cleanliness in those areas? You construct open air sinks. You bring hand sanitizer to people. You go out there and give a public lecture on the importance of, of maintaining some distance and so on, because you're organized. So public action is crucial, but public action cannot happen in a society where social organization is destroyed. You need to build social institutions alongside public state institutions.
Mhm. That's how I see also the role of technology. Even this fact that we are doing this very DIY, do-it-yourself, punkish podcast. You can see my studio. This is also due to the fact that the internet can still be used. Perhaps they will use the opportunity to now implement 5G internet without even asking anyone. That's also one possibility. There is also a possibility that in countries such as Hungary and so on, there will be certain restrictions on the internet. Everything is possible. But on the other side, what the coronavirus showed, at least I feel it like that, is that you have social distancing, which is a misleading term completely, I think. It should be physical distancing. But at the same time, you have more social cooperation than ever. I mean, just when I look at the questions which are coming here, people watching this, 20,000 people watched it since yesterday. I think it will grow and grow and so on. What we are trying to do now, besides doing what DiEM25 usually does, policy paper, but also politics in the parliaments, on the streets and so on, now it's obviously it's not possible to be on the streets anymore. But this is a fantastic opportunity for us who are in the privilege to have a home or house to connect even better. So one reason more why I'm so glad that you're here, because you're giving us a perspective which is not this usual European Western-centric perspective. And there comes a question which is connected to something what you said. It's connected to Cuba. And the question is, what do you say to the right-wing argument that Cuba is really just sending its doctors abroad to earn foreign currency for the Cuban regime to trade with?
Well, that criticism well, let me put it this way. I would take that criticism seriously if I saw doctors from Germany, doctors from the United States, doctors from Canada, doctors from the United Kingdom, doctors from these countries going to places like, for instance, let's say even Italy. Now Italy, new country of the third world. If we saw doctors from these privileged countries traveling, then I think we could ask the question, why is Cuba? Is it just for foreign exchange? I mean, it's a remarkable thing to even think that. We saw doctors in the Ebola crisis who went and were working in West Africa, in Sierra Leone, different places. One of them contracted Ebola, went back to Cuba, healed, wrote about it, and went back to work in the field. And he wrote beautifully, movingly about what he was doing. So to impute to these doctors that they are merely instruments of foreign exchange, to collect foreign exchange, I think it's a disingenuous question. I'm not saying the person asking it is disingenuous, because saying, what would you say to the right wing? The right wing is being disingenuous, because I would say to the right wing, well, you're a doctor. Why don't you go to the front lines and try to heal people? Why is it that we keep seeing socialist doctors, Chinese doctors, Cuban doctors on? Let's take Wuhan just for a second. It was so interesting. In, I think, early February, the Communist Party of China said all Communist Party members have to be frontline workers in this. And an enormous number of Communist Party member doctors went to Wuhan as the frontline. So when you saw that video of the medical practitioners removing their mask, I don't know how many of you noticed, but they had the Communist Party pin. They were all Communist Party members. They were told the reason you joined the Communist Party is to serve the people. So we don't want non-communist doctors unless they want to be there. We don't want to force them out of employment to be in such a hazardous place. But you have, you've joined the party to serve the people. So it's an obligation. And I think that's something I tip my hat to that kind of motivation. So I would say to the right wing, let's see your doctors come. Your right wing doctors go into the slums to help people, to vaccinate them. I don't see them. Therefore, I don't take your question seriously.
Yeah, I would just add something because I have a friend who is a doctor in Croatia, and I get first-hand information from him, and I know how difficult it is for them. I mean, even if these doctors didn't travel, which is not their responsibility, it's the responsibility of the states to say we will exchange and we will be smart. I think Cuba is also being smart, because once the coronavirus hits in Cuba, they will have the experience. And that's what all the doctors, all the states and doctors in Europe could have done earlier, I think. But I think, it's the responsibility of the state. But what I can see with doctors all across Europe, these days in Spain, you've seen how many of them are infected, in what kind of conditions they work. Or in France, I've seen these images recently, how Macron's police is smashing a protest by the medical workers. And there you have it, for years you have been suppressing working conditions, you have been privatizing hospitals, austerity and so on. And now these people are on the front line, to put it like that. So, I mean, honestly, for me, the heroes are the doctors, the waste collectors, the shop assistants, all those people who are, on the front line.
In the last newsletter we did, there was a line which is, I'd prefer a planet of nurses to a planet of bankers.
Yeah, and I prefer robots to do the jobs of shop assistants, so they don't have to be, but not owned by platform capitalism, but which would be socialized owned. I mean, yeah, we are slowly coming to an end. Do you have perhaps something to add, or can you give us an insight? What are your next steps with these concrete proposals? I think that would be useful for people to know.
Yes, thanks a lot. I mean, I would really welcome if people went and read the proposals. They are at our website, thetricontinental.org. They are in Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Hindi, range of languages, Malay. We want people to endorse it by Thursday. We want organizations to endorse it as well. We're going to maintain the pressure, build a campaign. This is a battle of ideas. That's the most important thing. This is not just about putting out a platform there and just watching it. We want to develop this, build it, put pressure, deepen our understanding. We want to, bring back a question of what is the program of action for a country. I was so happy to see that in the middle of this cruelty that the Venezuelan government is experiencing, the most recent cruelty by the International Monetary Fund, denying the request from Venezuela for funds for medicals. I was so happy to see yesterday the Venezuelan government said that all salaries will be paid till December 2020. They said that all health care will be maintained. Rents are now completely forgiven for an extended period of time, and that utility bills are all forgiven. I mean, they're not talking about, you don't have to pay it now, but you can pay it later. This is complete forgiveness. This is an economy that is in serious crisis. The government put people before the well-being of the economy. I think this is key. People like that in a position of great defeat, in terms of the attack they are facing, the economy is in a very difficult position. People like that standing tall and saying, we put people before profit. I think there's a lot to learn. This is part of the battle of ideas.
Thanks a lot, Vijay. And I must notice at the end that you also decorated your studio. And it's interesting because you have a 68 poster behind yourself, but it's about a street, the beauty of the street, right? We cannot see the beauty, but I think it's up there. Wait a second. And this is not a nostalgic poster anymore. This is a poster where we are nostalgic of the future, where we could go to the street.
This is actually a picture made by an Irish artist whose name is Colin Dark. And it's a reconstruction of the 1968 in a different way. So, we go back to the past. We are not nostalgic for the past. The past for us is not a destination. It's a resource.
Thanks a lot, Vijay, for being our guest tonight. Tomorrow, thanks a lot, everyone who was here, for your questions. Register for tomorrow at the same time at 7 p.m. Central European Time. Our guest is Larry Charles, the great co-creator of Seinfeld, Curb Your Enthusiasm, and a great series at Netflix. We will be discussing the role of hope and humor in times of coronavirus, because we need jokes and we need to cheer up. But stay at home, watch DiEM25, and we will tell you when to get out to the streets. Bye-bye. Thanks a lot.